For my debate, I will be focusing on the question, should members of the Bush administration be put on trial for war crimes related to torture? And I will be focusing on the pro side. I do believe that they should be put on trial for the events that occurred. So, during the Bush administration, he was blamed for acts of war crimes or even looked hated at. A war crime is an act that constitutes a violation offense of the laws of war. The United Nations has articles for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights under the United Nations website. I also found the document with these articles. There's 30. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was assembled in Paris, December 10th of 1948 by the General Assembly, and the document is set out to protect human rights in all nations. So I'm going to focus on the articles, mainly 1, 2, 5, 8, and 12. And then from the United Nations website, I will also use the articles from the Convention Against Torture document. So my first source is an article written by the BBC in November of 2005 with the title, U.S. Does Not Torture, Bush Insists. The whole point of the article is to discuss how during George W. Bush's presidency, other nations were planning attacks on the U.S., and the Bush administration was trying to address those problems. The article says, quote, enemies were plotting to hurt the U.S. and his government would pursue them, but would do so under the law, end quote. Bush claims that all the attacks sought out by the U.S. were strictly for defense. The same article by the BBC has a direct quote from Bush that states, quote, our country is a war and our government has the obligation to protect the American people, end quote. During the Bush administration, the terrorist organization Al-Qaeda was a key target. Most of the war crimes that Bush committed were in Afghanistan and Iraq with the terrorist organizations. My second source is an article published by the New York Times in their newspaper, and it was titled, Bush Administration Says Congress Should Tighten Definition of War Crimes, on August 3rd, 2006, by Kate Zernick. So the article discusses how the definition should be fixed under the Geneva Conventions. The Bush administration was trying to fight against terrorist war crimes, as I mentioned earlier. The article says that, quote, the Supreme Court ruled in late June that terrorism suspects must be extended the protections outlined in a provision of the Geneva Conventions that prohibits outrageous upon personal dignity and in particular, humiliating and degrading treatment, end quote. Basically stating that, you gotta, when you're working with prisoners of war and stuff like that, you can't go against, humanity and their human rights, which is also basically saying the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which I talked about earlier with the UN. Another quote by the New York Times discusses the U.S. troops being prosecuted under the U.S. War Crimes Act. It says, quote, and because the U.S. War Crimes Act passed a decade ago makes it a felony to violate that provision, he said that troops could be prosecuted for interrogation tactics, considered too harsh, end quote. Bush wanted our defense to be protected when fighting their targets and entering war zone countries like Iraq and Afghanistan, especially with 9/11 occurring. This all happened in 2004, 2006 after the fact. In June of 2006, quote, military tribunals that President George W. Bush had established that suspects held at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, violated international law and were not authorized by U.S. statute, end quote. This is the fact that troops went into Cuba under Bush's administration and went against international law to do so. If they were not authorized, they were not allowed to go in and attack. So this goes against Articles 1 and 5 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Article 1 states that all human beings are born free and equal and are endowed with reason and should act towards one another in a friendly way. So no violence against one's neighbors. And Article 5 says no one shall be exposed to torture or to cruel, inhumane, or degrading punishment. So the troops violated basic human rights of the individuals in Cuba by holding the detention center. In the detention center, they can do, whatever their qualified to do under Bush's administration. Not necessarily with the convention, the Geneva Convention, or the UN or anything like that. So my third source is from The Economist, and it's a newspaper article headed "The Torture Controversy Fanning the Flames." On June 24th, 2004, this was written. The article starts by saying, quote, "The White House at last tried to come clean over the allegations that it somehow authorized the apparent torture of prisoners in Iraq and elsewhere," end quote. Bush was giving immunity during this time to troops because they had been committing war crimes under his administration. On the other hand, other countries who found out about the occurrence wanted the troops and Bush to be sent to the ICC to be put on trial for their alleged allegations. The ICC stands for International Criminal Court, it's located in the Netherlands, and it's used to prosecute persons who have committed war crimes, acts against humanity, aggressive crimes, anything like that. Bush tried to argue and say that his troops were still following guidelines and using legal tactics from the Department of Justice. The only exception is with Al-Qaeda, the organization in Afghanistan, where America has reserved the right to not observe the Geneva Conventions when handling suspected Al-Qaeda fighters. There was a quote that says, "Critics are increasingly turning their attention from Iraq to Afghanistan, where America has reserved the right to not observe the Geneva Conventions when handling suspected Al-Qaeda fighters," end quote. This is due to 9/11 happening on September 1st of 2001, so the Geneva Convention and the UN became stricter on terrorist organization and war crimes. Because of this, with Bush going after, Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda, it was kind of hard to figure out if it was a war crime or if it was him going against military. Going through, it was definitely a war crime to me. With the Bush controversy on war crimes happening with Al-Qaeda, it's harder to prosecute because they were acting against fighters who were terrorists, like I just mentioned. The American troops still committed crimes, though, because of George W. Bush's go-ahead. So, lastly, there was a statement that read, quote, "At least 5 suspects have died in American custody in Afghanistan. At least 3 of the deaths were ruled homicides, but 18 months later, no one's been prosecuted for them," end quote. This just goes to show that through our military and through the president that, no one's getting prosecuted because it doesn't show that it was an act of a war crime, even though it was in that country, and due to the Geneva Convention and other sources. And then lastly, my fourth source was actually in a book titled "George W. Bush, War Criminal: The Bush Administration's Liability for 269 War Crimes." It was written by Michael Haas, and it discusses the different types of crimes committed, such as aggressive and how the treatment was for those people and the prosecution. Crime of aggression was outlawed in the United Nations Charter in 1945, as well as war crime trials. International law imposes restrictions on the uses of military force. With this being said, George W. Bush declared war in Afghanistan in October of 2001 and a war with Iraq in March of 2003. Haas says in his book, quote, "When Bush publicly contemplated war with Afghanistan, the Taliban authorities in Kabul reportedly offered to hand over Osama bin Laden, the leader of Al-Qaeda, also the main leader for the attack of 9/11, for trial, since the foreign Arabic-speaking Al-Qaeda enjoyed little support among the Pashto-speaking Taliban," end quote. This was before the Bush administration imposed the war crimes on them. Al-Qaeda was still willing to cooperate and hand over their leader because of 9/11 just occurring. But Bush thought that the move was insufficient and that their government was still lacking in power to cooperate with America, so they didn't. This is direct proof that Bush ignored them and continued to do it in his way and keep troops in Afghanistan and Iraq. Saddam Hussein was attempting to pay the United States around $1 billion to leave Iraq and to continue on, but Bush wouldn't allow it. There was a quote, The United States attacked both countries without adequately seeking an alternative or peaceful way to resolve differences, end quote. The Bush administration wanted to start a preemptive war, which is not considered self-defense actually under the international law, making what he was doing an act of war crime. Bush was out for blood in Afghanistan and Iraq. That's pretty obvious. There was a quote, on January 29, 2002, in his State of the Union address, Bush claimed the right to make war on any country while dangers gather. That is on any country deemed hostile to the United States. Since the United Nations did not authorize the war with Afghanistan or Iraq, Bush thereby became an international outlaw defying international law. His repeated references to military options in dealing with Iran also qualifies as war crimes. End quote. Bush was known for captivity of persons from opposing nations during wars and going against many of the Geneva Convention guidelines. And that is why they should be put on trial for the torture and the war crimes that were committed.